Our pastor, Adam Erickson, sends out an email every week announcing the coming Sunday service, telling us a bit about what he has in mind. And for the service last Sunday, he sent out an email that began with this sentence: "It feels like the world is falling apart." And I expect that many people feel that way. But has there ever been a year, I wonder, when the same thing couldn't be said? For thousands of people, for millions of people in the world, this is today the worst day of their lives. And that can be said in every day since the dawn of human history. There's nothing new under the sun. That's what the author of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament said 200 or 300 years before Christ. And if the events of this past year, in your own life or in the life of our community, or the life of our planet, if there have been events that have upset you, distressed you, consider what the world was like 2,000 years ago when Jesus lived in Palestine. The people of the first century in Palestine were surrounded by poverty and disease. They lived under the thumb of the Roman army that occupied their land. The possibility of political freedom or economic freedom, those were unheard of, things you didn't even dream about. And their faith communities were dominated by a patriarchal system that valued legalism over loving kindness. It was a narrow, constricted, rigid, fearful society in first century Palestine. And as for Jesus himself, the prophet Isaiah had predicted the coming of a Messiah who would be despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And that certainly describes Jesus. He was rejected, and not only by the religious establishment of the day, the religious establishment that he so often challenged, but he was rejected by his own neighbors, the folks that he had grown up with in Nazareth. When he spoke in the synagogue in Nazareth during a Sabbath service one week, and he suggested that God's love extended to people who were not Jewish, his neighbors didn't just turn on him, they drove him out of town. So he was rejected by many. And acquainted with grief? Yes, that too. The Gospel of John tells us that Jesus wept when his friend Lazarus died. And Luke says that on Palm Sunday, Jesus wept when he was approaching Jerusalem and he first caught sight of the outskirts of the city. Jesus wept, and I doubt those were the only 2 times that he ever wept in his life. Sorrow, disappointment, discouragement. Jesus knew all about those emotions, and maybe that's why so many of his stories were focused on maintaining hope and on persevering in times of trouble. Now, he wasn't the first person who told stories like that. The Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures tell us of similar stories. Stories about people who went through tough times and who were able to hang on to their faith and keep on going. The book of Ruth is one example. The story of a woman who was left penniless when her husband died and who persevered against all the odds to make a new life and a new family for herself. A widow took a hopeless situation and turned it into something positive. We admire people like that. People who are persistent, people who keep going. And Jesus admired people like that. One of his best-known stories is one that Adam preached about a few weeks ago. It was a story also about a widow who had a legal complaint of some kind and who was having no luck in getting a judge to listen to her. Now, a single woman going to court by herself in first century Palestine, she didn't have a chance. That's not how she saw it. She was determined to be heard. She was determined to be taken seriously. And she kept going back to the judge until he finally agreed to hear her case. We're not told what the case was about. We don't know what the judge decided, but that's not the point. Jesus told that story, Luke says, in order to show his listeners that they should keep on praying and never lose heart. Never lose heart. Keep plugging away, Jesus says. He said it to Mary and Peter and Matthew and Martha. And he says it to you and me too. Keep plugging away, and there will be a better tomorrow. Jesus liked to quote from the Psalms, and I'm sure he was familiar with the verse in Psalm 30 that says, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." Jesus wasn't just familiar with that verse, he lived it. When he was nailed to the cross, it seemed like everything that he had stood for, everything he had taught, everything he had said and done, it had all come to an end. A smashing dead end. But the joy of Easter was just 2 days away. In the darkest moments of our lives, when everything seems bleak, there is reason for hope. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And that is as true for nations as it is for individuals. It feels like the world is falling apart. That's what Adam Erickson told us last week. And when it comes to the civic life of our nation, our public life, so to speak, there have been plenty of reasons this year to feel discouraged, whether you're thinking about what goes on in the halls of Congress in Washington, or the county courthouse with the Clackamas County Commission, or any other level of government in between. There are plenty of reasons to be discouraged. But there have been positive events in our nation too, in our civic life, and we shouldn't lose sight of them in this season of Advent. Think of it. George Santos is no longer a member of Congress. And if that doesn't ring a bell, I'll fill you in later. But more importantly, 2023 was the first year ever in our country that more electricity was generated with renewable energy than with coal. Now, it's too bad that didn't happen a few years ago, not to mention a few decades ago. But even baby steps in the fight against global warming are worth celebrating. And did you hear the news from the world of nature about the Amur tiger? You may not have heard of the Amur tiger. And that's because it used to be known as the Siberian tiger, but they don't call it the Siberian tiger anymore because its natural habitat in Siberia has been completely destroyed by human encroachment. And there are no Siberian tigers in Siberia anymore. So now scientists call it the Amur tiger. It's high on the list of endangered species. Maybe 500 tigers at most survive in this world. But the good news last month was that an Amur tiger named Rika gave birth to 3 healthy cubs in the St. Louis Zoo. Excuse me. So 3 cheers for Rika. Now maybe tiger cubs don't qualify as part of our civic life, but there is one other bit of news that definitely was part of our civic life, and it happened right here at home. When voters last month in the North Clackamas School District approved a tax measure that will pay for classroom teachers for the next 5 years. And voters in our neighbors in the Westland Wilsonville school district did the same thing. That happened right here at home, and it's something to celebrate in our civic life. We look for reasons to celebrate when the world seems gloomy. It's natural to do so. It's human nature. And that was certainly true of Americans during the Great Depression. Now that was a dark time in our country. Millions of people lost their jobs, thousands lost their homes, many were made refugees in their own country as they went from town to town or state to state even, looking for work, looking for a job. But out of those hard times came some of the most optimistic and cheerful songs that have ever been written in our country. Those of you of a certain age may remember three of them that I'm going to mention. They all came out in 1930, when the full impact of the Depression after the stock market crash of 1929, the full impact of the Depression was just being felt as it crept across the country. Three songs I want to mention that came out of that year. First, Forget Your Troubles, Come On, Get Happy. If you know Judy Garland, you know that she sang that as her signature song later on. But in the Depression years, that song was in many movies. It was on the radio constantly. Just like the other two songs. Keep your sunny side up. Hide the side that gets blue. And if you have 9 sons in a row, don't forget that baseball teams make money too. Keep your sunny side up. And the third song, similar. Grab your coat and get your hat, leave your worry on the doorstep, just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. These were songs of hope and optimism. They were written by people who agreed with the author of the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. A cheerful heart is good medicine. Who exactly wrote all of the Proverbs? Probably a lot of different people. About 700 years before Christ. So these are old notions, old teachings, old proverbs. A cheerful heart is good medicine. And whoever it was that came up with that proverb was onto something. Because modern science tells us that is true. Research at the Johns Hopkins Medical Center in Baltimore says that people with a positive attitude are 13% less likely to have a heart attack than people who have a negative attitude. And another study found that smiling, even fake smiling reduces your heart rate and your blood pressure, especially in times of stress. A cheerful heart, a positive attitude, that's good medicine. And so is a smile on your face. Try it. You don't need to rely on a study from Johns Hopkins. Do your own research. Try it every morning. Look in the mirror, smile. Take a moment to be grateful for something. Maybe it'll make a difference in the day. And smiling, that of course brings me to a fourth song that follows the last one. Another song from the Depression years. Let a smile be your umbrella on a rainy, rainy day. When skies are gray, don't worry or fret. A smile will bring the sunshine and you'll never get wet. Now that's a positive attitude, if there ever was one, especially in rainy Oregon. But I like to think that it's the kind of song that Jesus sings. Jesus did sing, you know. Both Matthew and Mark say that he and the disciples sang a hymn at the Last Supper. And I'll bet he broke into song every now and then as he walked around. I'm also willing to bet that he smiled a lot too, don't you think? He believed, he acted like he believed, he told people that he believed that tomorrow could be a better day, that you and I can be better people, that the world can be a better place. There was an awful lot of darkness in the world that Jesus knew, just as there is in the world that we know. But the light that came into the world with that birth in Bethlehem, that birth that we are about to celebrate in a few days, that light shines on in the darkness, according to the Gospel of John, and darkness has never put it out. That light, the light of Christ, that light illuminates every broken place that it finds. Every broken thing in your life, and in my life, in the life of this church, the life of this nation. Christ's light illuminates. No individual action that you or I will ever take will stop climate change, or put an end to racism, or provide housing for all who need it, or bring peace to Ukraine and Palestine. But we gather in this church. We gather as a community to support one another with optimism and with hope. A hope that's based on the person and the teachings of Jesus. A man for whom there were no hopeless situations. A man who never gave in to despair. He didn't heal every sick person. He didn't end poverty. He didn't bring democracy to the Roman Empire, but he never gave up. He never stopped reaching out to people. He never stopped reaching out to the outcasts, the marginalized, and he never turned anyone away. He kept his sunny side up. And if you doubt it, just think of all the times he said, cheer up, cheer up. Sometimes when you are reading the New Testament, the Gospels, and you come across a passage that is quoting Jesus, setting out something that he said in a prayer or a sermon or just an off-the-cuff talk to his disciples, when you're reading those quotations from Jesus, you may get the impression that he spoke like a Shakespearean actor. Majestic phrases, perfect grammar, a great orator, like Martin Luther King or John Kennedy. That's not how Jesus taught. He was a man of the people, and he talked like a man of the people. He didn't say, I've analyzed the data and I've concluded that you'll feel better if you cultivate a positive attitude. He never said that. What he did say was, cheer up. He said it to a paralyzed man he had healed. Cheer up, he said, your sins are forgiven. He said it when the disciples saw him walking on water and thought they were seeing a ghost. Cheer up, he said, it's just me, don't be scared. He said it to the woman in the crowd who had suffered from bleeding, from hemorrhages for many years. This woman who reached out in the crowd where he was passing by just so that she could touch the hem of his cloak. Cheer up, daughter, he said to her. Cheer up. Your faith has made you well. And he said it to the disciples just before his crucifixion. You're going to suffer plenty in this world, he said to them. But cheer up. I have overcome you. Cheer up. He said it often, and he says it to you and me. He says it to everyone who is lonely, or discouraged, or depressed, or confused, or suffering, and that's every one of us at one time or another. Cheer up, he says. No matter how gloomy the situation may be. And it's one of the lessons of maybe the most famous story he ever told, the story of the prodigal son. You know that story. The older son stayed home. He worked hard. He helped run the farm. He did his duty. While the younger son took his inheritance, ran off to the big city, squandered everything, wild living. Now he's broke. And now he goes back home with his tail between his legs, not at all sure about how he's going to be received. Would his father forgive him? Would his father welcome him back? Or would he give him a cold shoulder? Well, guess what? When his father saw him coming up the road, he ran out to greet him. He welcomed him home without any conditions, without any anger, without any "I told you so." And he ordered a big feast to celebrate his son's return. And then Jesus says, they began to be merry. The whole bunch of them, the family, the servants, the hired help, maybe the whole neighborhood, they began to be merry. And that included the son, especially the son, because he realized he didn't have to beat himself up with regret. He didn't have to make excuses for that. His father loved him just the way he was. And that's what Jesus is saying to us as well, isn't it? Jesus was an optimist, and his message is a message of optimism, hope, of liberation from whatever guilt or worry or feeling of inadequacy that we have. So I'll say it again. When you get up in the morning, look in the mirror and smile at yourself and say, you are good enough. You have done enough. Cheer up. God loves you just the way you are. And Jesus walked through the same world that you and I walked through. But the world looked different to him because he saw it as God would have him see it. And he wants us to see it in that way too. Look at your family, your neighbors, your co-workers, your fellow church members, a stranger in the grocery store. Look at them with kindness. Look at them with a smile. And when you do that, you demonstrate to the world that a cheerful heart is indeed good medicine. And it's good medicine not only for yourself, but for everyone around you. Because a cheerful heart radiates. It's contagious. There was a woman named Julianne of Norwich who lived in England more than 600 years ago, and some of you have heard me talk about her before. Her meditations on the Christian faith, she lived, by the way, during the century of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, they called it, the worst lethal pandemic that we know of in all of human history. There are over 100 million people in Europe who died of the plague that year. And her meditations, Julianne's meditations on the Christian faith, are the earliest known writings by any woman in the English language that we know of. And she's admired, at least by me, and I hope by you, for her teaching that God is both our mother and our father. And she's admired for another passage in her writings, too. She described a period in her life when she was seriously ill. Perhaps it was the plague itself. She was so close to death that the priests had given her the last rites of the church. And Julianne wrote that as she was lying there in her sickbed, Jesus appeared to her in a vision. And he said this to her: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Julianne recovered. She lived another 30 years, and she carried those words in her heart for the rest of her life. And they are good words for us to carry in our hearts, too, in this Advent season and in all the days to come. All shall be well. In your life, in my life, in the life of this church, in the life of this community, in the life of our nation, in the life of the world. That's the promise of God. All shall be well.